the day I met you. I forget just why I left you. It's insane. Stay and play that Blink-182 song that we beat to death in Tucson. Okay. I know it breaks your heart. Moved to the city in a broke down car. 4 years, no calls. Now I'm looking pretty in a hotel bar. And I can't stop. No, I can't stop. So baby, pull me closer in the backseat of your Rover that I know you can't afford. Bite that tattoo on your shoulder. Pull the sheets right off the corner of the mattress that you stole from your roommate back in Boulder. We ain't ever getting older. 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 So baby, pull me closer in the backseat of your Rover that I know you can't afford. Bite that tattoo.
Good morning, grasshoppers. We are looking at Bobby Fischer versus Petrosian. Fischer is black in this game from Belgrade, game number 2. And Bobby Fischer plays a recipe against the English opening that I used for quite some time because I was a King's Indian player. And today I think that it's also adopted by Grunfeld players. In fact, I know that it's adopted by Grunfeld players. Basically, after the move G6, White has to choose whether or not they're going to continue attacking the center. And of course, personally, after the move E4, Black can lock down on the center with C5 and achieve control over the D4 square, as we are planning on attacking the dark squares. And in this particular position, E5 is also possible, but against the Iron English, I have to say that White has these opportunities to break later with F4, which I don't necessarily like. For example, after moves such as Knight C3, Knight C6, G3, Bishop G7, Bishop G2, let's just give Black Knight on B to D7, Knight on G to E7 for consistency. White gets to play the move Knight on G to E2, and this is basically a closed Sicilian reversed, where White has the opportunity to break with F4 as he sees fit. In fact, F4 immediately would be met by Bishop to G4 and the seizing of the D4 square, so therefore White should continue his development along the lines of D3, and if Bishop G4 we could actually kick it back. And we have two fronts to play on as White. If we were playing White in this position, we could play Rook to B1 with the idea of B4, B5. And we also have the option of playing F4 at any time for a pawn break against the center. Now this does not work, going back to our initial position. This does not work necessarily against C5. But we should lock down on the center first with moves like Bishop to G7, and White does have an opportunity to take over the center, and this is right where we were. If you're a King's Indian player, you're completely at home in this particular position as you're going to reach standard King's Indian classical variations. However, die-hard English players, if you really feel like you're going to play this, you might as well start with the move C5 right away and lay claim to the D4 square. This is easily the recommended move. And I would also recommend you David Vigorito's Symmetrical English course on Chessable. But Bobby Fischer chose this particular move order in order to lock down on the d4 square. You can see that three attackers are focused on the d4 and the dark squares in the center, while white has an equal number of attackers on the light squares. In any event, Petrosian, being a very conventional player, plays knight f3. Now, in the Mega database, I actually have a game against Eric Moscow as black, where in the database our names are reversed. So Eric Moscow with a K, K-O-W, M-O-S-K-O-W. Eric Moscow in the 1992 Enhanced Financial Services Round Robin event, where I got my first FIDE rating, or where I finalized my first FIDE rating, I should say. Eric Moscow adopted a very similar symmetrical system. And ironically, it's hard to tell the difference between the two of us, but he continued with d4, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with this particular position, as black equalizes rather easily against this isolated pawn. Sharpness, thank you for the follow. Welcome. We're doing a little bit of an instructional stream here on The Unstoppable American, a book that was gifted to the dojo thanks to our Amazon wishlist. And as a pretense for the Amazon wishlist, all books that are donated to the dojo get a couple and a half hours, if not 3 hours, of review. And this is the second game we're doing from this book. The first book, I did not actually put The Unstoppable American on the stream layout cover, and I should have. I realize that now, because after all, this is a review for the book. I'm not receiving any income from New in Chess. This is a completely unbiased review of a rather terrific book that outlines and tells the story of Bobby Fischer's 18 months to the World Championship title. And it is quite the eventful 18 months. There are a lot of background stories. It is quite worth it. It is a lovely book featuring Fischer in his prime. And he does an amazing job. Just make sure I return to my page, as I am referencing the book a little bit during the analysis. Now, Fischer does play c5 to lock down on that square. Whoops, I veered off course just a little bit. I didn't follow up with bishop to g7, then knight to c6. Fischer does play against Petrosian in a very conventional manner, and he follows the same exact recipe for building up in the center, potentially giving himself an isolated pawn with that at g to e7. Now, I do recommend using a touch screen when you study, because then you get the pseudo-tactile feel of moving the pieces the way they're supposed to be moved. Now, we've succeeded to a good extent in our primary goals of activating all of our pieces. The bishop on c8 is the next piece to try to address, as Fischer plays d5. And knowing that his opponent isn't necessarily going to capture, he plans on putting his bishop on b7. Again, we mentioned this space-grabbing move, rook to b1, in the introduction. Senior Black Knight, how are you, man? Good to see you. Did we get your sound alert? I don't know if I heard it. What in the world happened to that sound alert? Let's take a quick peek, just to make sure that you got it for your 50 channel points. Where are you from, Sharpness? What are your interests in chess? Do you play over the board? Are you a member of a local club? All of those questions are worth knowing the answers to. So, as we mentioned before, Petrosian expands on the queen side with b4, and Fischer decides to give his opponent a pair of hanging pawns. Now this is not necessarily a true pair of hanging pawns, because an ideal pair of hanging pawns would be pawns without support. Notice there are two open files on either side of these two pawns. They're just sort of hanging there, not protecting each other. They have to be defended by pieces. And in this particular situation, ideally, since we have pawn structures, whoops, like this, the ideal hanging pawns would be on d4 and c4 if we wish to attack them. Hanging pawns, by the way, or isolated pawn couplets, as they've sometimes been called, there are a couple of pawns side by side with two open files on either side of them that may be either strengths or weaknesses. And isolated pawn couplets often shove forward, and at times they will create what could be either a strength or a weakness, depending on the position of an isolated pawn, right? An isolated pawn could be either a strength or a weakness, depending on the situation. And in this particular game, Bobby Fischer plays what Jan Timman in the book calls a novelty. Now today, of course, this is the #1 move played in the opening database. And it is a very, it is a very logical move. We're targeting the c4 pawn. And in fact, White's best move in this particular position is the one that that Petrosian plays, c5, and after b takes c5, b takes c5, Fischer now goes about a very cool plan to blockade and attack this isolated pawn and win it. And this doesn't necessarily mean that he's got an advantage. After all, Black has an isolated a7 pawn that White could in return attack. So Fischer goes about immediately attacking the pawn, which should be sacrificed by Petrosian. I'm just going to flip this board for a moment, and I'm going to give you 45 seconds, and you should pause the video to see what White's next best move is. Again, we're looking for candidate moves for White. Even though Fischer's Black in this position, we're going to look for candidate moves. If I can start my timer here. Where are you, timer? My timer is up, as I already know. Let's fire off the timer. And ideally, you should give 3 moves that White could play in this particular position. For example, bishop to e3 would defend the pawn. Knight to a4 would defend the pawn. Those are 2 very logical candidate moves. And also, they would be counterattacking the knight on a5. And there are other possibilities in this position. So please give 3 candidate moves. Now the idea is to look for all of the good moves in the position. And once you have a catalog of the good moves, you can shop among those good moves with the help of maybe a bit of further analysis. Which of those moves is just a good move? Which of those moves is the best move? And perhaps just a better than good move. For example, the move bishop e3 would hang the knight on c3. Good day, Lauren. How are you? It is a little bit late for you, I understand, in Australia. I just discovered that Australia has 5 time zones during daylight savings. And if you don't believe it, you should Google it. It's a very strange array of 5 time zones. Yes, you missed the tournament, but that's okay. I mean, you have to set your Google Calendar. I believe that you can actually import this calendar into your calendar. I've not actually done that, but I would absolutely import the Google Calendar into your calendar, and the notifications can be set for yourself for all of those events. Then you can set your notification at an hour or 2, perhaps. Just a reminder, I do this for the Opera Spiel events. We were picking 3 moves, it's not too late for you. I was just explaining the candidate move process that every Grandmaster and strong player goes through they instantly just absorb and look at all of the good moves in the position. They don't look for the best move right away. They don't single out one move and try to make that one move work for 3 to 5 minutes. No, they really do look at all of the good moves in the position. So for example, putting more pressure on the knight with queen a4 might be a possibility. Knight a4 defends the c5 pawn, and Petrosian, who's playing white against Fischer in this game, actually plays the second best move or third best move in this position. There are a few moves that could be played. I'll give you a moment. Anyone who's watching this video on demand should certainly consider what's going on for themselves, maybe even pausing the video if they needed more time, but try not to test yourself because too harshly, because you are merely training yourself to look at a variety of positions in a variety of ways in a manner that internalizes the candidate move process over and over and over again until you get that down without actually obsessing over finding the best move. And time's up. Fischer actually played the move that I've already mentioned, which was Petrosian actually played the move knight a4. The most surprising second best move in the position to me is bishop to g5, with the idea of attacking the knight, forking a rook on c5 and on f8, and removing the defender of the knight on e7. So if black were to capture the free knight on c3, we would simply remove the defender of the knight on e7 and capture, and then reinforce the pawn on c5. And this would be a perfectly acceptable and normal continuation. We could reinforce the pawn on c5 with the rook on f to c1. We can anchor the bishop on d6. And there's absolutely nothing going on here for the most part. So for example, if rook to d7, white has more than one choice in this position. We could even play the move rook on f to c1, because the move bishop to d2 could be met by capturing. And it would be a discovery on that particular bishop as well. So black would be in a little spot of trouble with the potential of forking on c6 if there are two pieces to be forked on these squares. So for example, let's just say knight t2, knight takes d2, the rook would have been overworked, and you can see that we have two attackers on the bishop on b7. And if black tried to throw in bishop takes g2, then we could simply secure our bishop on f6, making his king a relatively permanent weakness, and this would afford white a very clear advantage. It looks as though we're giving back the piece, but remember this bishop is hanging as well. So if black were to try to blockade, as he does in the game, then we can simply also consider doubling rooks. So getting back to the game after knight a5, returning to the black side of the board, Petrosian plays knight to a4, which is not as active. John Timman suggests the move knight to b5, and in this manner he gets to go after the a7 pawn as well as creating a lot of counterplay against the knight on a5, so that after rook takes c5 we can start creating pressure and really being a bother to this knight. Knight on e to c6, or even the counter-attacking move, bishop to c6, would be very cool. After all, bishop takes a5 is met by the further intrusive, annoying move, bishop queen to d7. Notice how black gets all of his pieces into the game faster than his opponent. And one of our other maxims of the dojo is that rooks are often activated by the stronger player who gets them to the right squares faster than the opponent. And really the placement of the rooks is key. So getting back to the rather dubious move knight a4, Fischer immediately blockades the pawn, creates a bit of a counterattack, and after queen to c2 and a rather hapless method of trying to defend the pawn, Fischer concentrates on targeting that pawn. White reinforces the pawn. Black tries to remove one of the defenders of the pawn. And white goes upon the counterattack. Notice that this knight on a4 is somewhat defended by the fact that rook takes b7 will happen. So if the bishop were to take on c4, black would be slightly better after this particular continuation, because we can desperado our queen for the rook. And the game would probably continue with maybe bishop takes c8, rook takes c8, rook takes c2. And black is slightly better with an outpost square on either d5 or a blockading square on c6. In any event, getting back to the move knight to e1 that was played by Petrosian, unveiling the bishop through to this square, Fischer decides that he's going to just continue improving his worst placed piece. What are the best or worst placed pieces is a question we have to ask ourselves every single time we play a chess game. And I am mainly doing this to further our YouTube, so please subscribe to the YouTube if you have not already, where you will find this video in a collection of great players to study. Great games and great players to study. I may even segregate them eventually by openings, as this is a very nice recipe for the English opening as black. White can hardly stop this without giving up on playing the English opening. Maybe by playing knight f3 and d4 we'll reach a different variation of the English opening, but it won't be a standard playing alone type of English opening with bishop g2, knight c3, and knight f3. Well, recognizing that the c5 pawn is in trouble, Petrosian relocates his knight to the square d3, or at least reinforces a knight on d3 in order to defend it. And now Fischer doesn't play the best possible move here, but he does play a highly energetic move. And we're going to ask you to find it. Candidate moves for white in this position. Pause the video if you're watching it on demand, and look for all of the good moves in the position, notwithstanding trying to find the best move. But there are several moves here that black can play. White is slightly better. Remember, this isolated pawn hasn't yet proven to be a weakness. So Fischer has won the first game of the match as white, and now only needs to, it's a best of 4 game match, the USSR versus the rest of the world in 1970. Fischer was playing board 2 against Petrosian. Bent Larsen, who had been playing far more actively and was equally as strong as Fischer to a good extent, was playing board 1 against Spassky. We're on the black side of the board now. Yep, we're on the black side of the board. I'll restart the clock for you. I won't be able to do this later, but we're always going to be doing black from now on. I just wanted you to see that Petrosian could have played far more actively, yet he managed to obtain a small microscopic advantage by playing standard and normal moves, logical standard moves. And as it turns out, So bishop takes d3 is capturing a rather superfluous knight. We're not getting rid of a knight on d3, but by capturing it, we're only replacing it with the knight on d2. So therefore, I would replace that one with, if you're concerned about your bishop at all, I would replace that one with the move a6. Just anchoring the bishop in place against any discoveries. And perhaps we can try to build up more pressure on the c5 pawn by doubling rooks. The best move, which is activating the last rook. Remember our rule, which was the stronger player gets the rooks to the better squares faster and more effectively than our opponents. This is a cover. This is not a cover. This song is too good to be a cover. I have to check this out. Wow. This is a cover by Jason Shannon. Very good, Jason. In any event, bishop takes b2 does something remarkably similar. I don't necessarily know if I could recommend bishop to b2. But knight takes c5, unfortunately, also falls a little bit short there. The three best moves in that particular position, by the way, Fischer played the next best move, perhaps the most active move, by targeting f2 and the c5 pawn. He played bishop to d4. After all, the queen is leading the battery. And this is not a good thing, because a move like e3 would be met by bishop takes c5, or even knight takes c5 because of the further discoveries. Let's take a look at it. So, for example, we could play knight takes c5, and if e takes d4, thanks to the help of the bishop, we're actually winning material here with a discovery and an x-ray on the rook on c1. So bishop to d4 is a rather profound and very active move. Fischer is borrowing an idea from Alekhine. Alekhine had a bishop on g2 once, which he shifted out to e4 in order to attack h7. And Fischer also employed that in his games. So he was certainly a student of Alekhine's. It wasn't even on your radar, but now it is. Now it is, because you've seen it, you've cataloged it. And by looking at Grandmaster and Master games like this, but first you have to test yourself to see if you have those moves, the moves of the Masters in your catalog. So as it turns out, the bishop on b5 is targeted by Petrosian's queen. And this is a little shifty. After all, the bishop isn't completely undefended. The queen is still there, and the pawn is lost. We have a nearly all minor piece endgame, as nothing's been exchanged just yet. Fischer amends this immediately, not fearing giving his opponent the bishop pair. So Fischer does have an outside pass pawn, and he does activate his last rook with rook on f to d8. And white decides against possibly the best move here. White chooses a highly technical move which was praised at the time, bishop to f3. But the moves that are a little bit more active are the skewering concept of rook to b5, skewing through to put pressure on the d5 square. After all, the queen is the only piece there. If the bishop moves, then the pressure on d5 will be immense, as we can remove one of the defenders of the pawn with bishop to g5. Although white has to give up the bishop pair for that one. Another truly interesting and good move is bishop to h6, which secures black having the less safe king. creates all sorts of tactical possibilities on the back rank, and may even weaken the king, as it might force the black bishop off the board. Now, the black squared bishop is essential for controlling the queening square, A1. As we're going to see, this could play a role in the game. So, rather than playing bishop to H6, it's rather unfortunate that this move is pretty good for white in the sense that we no longer have any back rank weaknesses and the king can step up. And it was a typical Petrosian move to a certain extent, securing the weakness on E2, improving the king position, and keeping all sorts of active counterplay against this. So Fischer goes into this another concept here in order to ensure the forward movement of the pawn with queen to C7, bishop to G5, and he's not at all worried about exchanging off the bishops. We can see that with the move queen to D4, white did not actually get anything here. This move gives black a rather significant advantage to play for. Honestly, black should have gone for simplification with either bishop takes D5 or putting immediate pressure on the pawn with rook to A7 to keep it from moving forward. Either of those moves probably would have hindered white further than putting the queen on D4. Now, the two question marks are mine, basically because it's a caveman-esque attack on the A7 pawn and the dark squares on the king side, which we can't take advantage of just yet. Fischer gets a free move on that one, by the way. That's why I don't like it. Fischer gets a free pass at tempoing the queen and potentially pushing forward. And the queen loses more time. And even more time as Fischer keeps improving his pieces by hitting the opponents. And then finally, the rook on C4 plants the seed for C4, forking the bishop and the queen. So notice how black, in the space of 4 to 5 moves, has improved his position immensely. His knight and his rook are ensuring the pushing of the pawn. They're just as active, and we have creative tactical threats as well. So now the bishop returns to its rightful home, and we already know that we criticized bishop to F3 in the first place. Now Fischer here probably could set up the ideal pawn structure for queen and rook and major piece endgames, but Fischer was not necessarily the greatest of all rook endgame players. Major piece endgame. He excelled far more in minor piece endgames than he did, in my opinion. And there's a famous story of how he wins a rook and pawn endgame in Seuss 1967, I believe. And his good friend, who later saves his life by giving him citizenship in Reykjavik, walks up to him and tells him, asks him, how did you win that drawn endgame? And Fischer insists that the endgame was winning all along. At which point, Olafsson manages to, in the Post-Mortem and over a series of analytical endeavors, draw the game time after time against Fischer, and Fischer can't believe that it's not winning. So the rook and pawn endgame that they were discussing, I'm hoping to find it one of these turns, sends Fischer into one of his well-known disappearances. He disappears for about a year, and he concentrates all of his willpower on the study of rook and pawn endgames. And this is almost essential to reaching another level in chess. You can never have enough stuff. Fischer instead doubles on the c-file, threatens to simplify on the back rank, and Petrosian avoids the simplification on the back rank by covering that square with his queen. After all, rook to c1 check would have traded a pair of rooks. And at the same time, the queen eyeballs the a7 pawn and prevents it from moving to a5. This doesn't mean that Fischer's not going to continue to gain time on the queen. And probably queen to a6 was the best move. Petrosian stops at a5. And with the move rook to c5, I should probably give queen to a5 a question mark, since after rook to c5, queen a3, we now see that Fischer gets to move the pawn forward. And already he's making progress. There is a 50-move rule for a draw in chess if there are no pawn moves or no exchanges. Oh, really? I wouldn't have chosen any of the active moves. Yeah, bishop to d4 was an active move. Black does have a safe draw, but Fischer is always playing for a win. He was truly uncompromising, but we'll see that his will could waver in the next game. Fischer versus Petrosian, round 3, as he only needs a half point once he wins this game to win the match, and he gets to win a Moscovich Russian-made car, which was recently reintroduced after all this time. The Moscovich was a car that was designed in Russia in 1929, and it continued throughout the years to 2001. And just this year, they have re-released Midnight Zeroishi. Thank you for the follow. Just this year, the Moscovich car is now available again, thanks to the war on Ukraine, apparently. Another side note, the Moscovich car, trivia, is a result of Renault, the French car maker, divested itself of its Russian automobile factories because they would not do business in Russia. So therefore, the Renault gives up its automobile plant in Moscow, and Moscow immediately nationalizes the automobile plant and makes that automobile plant a production line. And their first vehicle that they introduced was the Moscovich. You can read about this story, at least the story of Fischer winning the Moscovich car. By the way, the first board winner, Bent Larsen, should he have beaten Spassky, he would have gotten a Fiat from Italy. A small sports car-like vehicle that is quite popular in the rest of the world, a Fiat, F-I-A-T. But the Moscovich, well, it is a time-honored classic among Russian automobiles. Now here Fischer, once again, gains time on the queen with knight to c4. I'm not quizzing on too many of these automatic moves, but notice that he is improving his position and relocating his pieces to the best of his ability. He's also preventing a rook from coming in on b7, as that was a threat. And after king h2, king g7, rook to d1, Fischer is hunkering, and this is actually quite a good move, interestingly enough, because of a further part of the plan, which we're going to be quizzed on in just a moment. Queen to d7, and of course Fischer with the outside passed pawn doesn't need to be asked twice. Here, black to move, candidate moves for black. Sonu the Great, good morning. This is a review of an old game, but it's also a lesson format because we are quizzing and discussing your candidate moves. How well you can find all of the good moves in a position. For example, there are 3 very distinct moves here that could be played. 4 or 5, in fact, that will all be good for black, but I usually give 45 seconds, which is, 15 seconds a move. You should just try to find the good moves. Whether you find one pawn move, maybe a knight move, maybe a rook move, perhaps even a king move. And they don't have to be the best moves when you're looking for the candidate moves. North Carolina Dan, how are you? I'm wondering if this is Savannah Dan, formerly of Savannah, Georgia. Fischer actually does not play the best move in this position, which is one of the great reasons why 300 of my IP of your from 1300s. No. It's all right. Rating points are relative. They're only an average of your strength at any given time. You can go through a very good cycle and get those points back by being on your game. Knight f6, h5, and rook to c7. Absolutely, h5 should be included among the candidate moves. King f6 should be included among the candidate moves. The best move in the position, which would cut the king off from, cut the rook off from the a7 square, was not played by Fischer. And you did manage to find perhaps the second best move in the position, which also achieves the same goal, shifting the rook to the a7 square. The e5 square is not that necessarily important, because we are going to get behind this pawn and shove it as fast as humanly possible, and with the help of the knight, we may even win material because of that pawn flying up the board. There's no time really to grab this pawn, as all black has to do is activate his knight and then begin the onslaught with the pawn. And securing the kingside. Remember this pawn structure in major piece endings, queen and rook endings. The idea is that the pawn that is on f7 can be guarded by a king while it controls the center. So the king can actually walk around and control the center, all the same protecting the pawn on f7 in a rook and pawn ending. Okay, so this pawn structure here is one to be remembered. Petrosian instantly had already gone for it. This is a lesson to be learned from Alekhine versus Capablanca, the 34th match game, among others in that. Yep. So knight to c7 would have kept the rook on the board and cut off the white rook at the same time while intending to push. So as it turns out, returning to our position, Fischer plays a move that does serves two purposes. It prevents white's h5 and tags the rook. So this is actually quite a good move because both of those squares are under control. But unfortunately, Petrosian gets to get his rook behind the passed pawn. And after the move knight to g4 check, rook to c1 check, and rook to a1, Fischer's now got his rook in front of his own pawn. One thing I have to mention about the maxim of getting your rook behind a passed pawn is that whenever the pawn moves forward, the white rook actually expands in activity. And every time the pawn moves forward, a rook that is caught in front of a passed pawn will be reduced in activity. That rook will be reduced to one square eventually and ultimately. So you would rather have your rook behind a passed pawn, because when that pawn is going forward, the rook that is behind the passed pawn will be the one which will receive greater scope. And Fischer does find the best move here, securing his, white plays e4. Otherwise, black would have played e4 in that particular position. I forgot that it was white to move for just a moment. And onward goes the pawn. Note that the bishop is immobilized, so therefore we have to unpin the bishop from the rook on a1. We have to unpin the bishop in order to at least have it in the game. And now, with an immediate threat to the pawn on a2, Petrosian goes for an unfortunate tactic which doesn't seem to work. It might have been better to keep the rooks on the board, as the endgame is seriously technically winning for black now. There's just nothing to be done about this particular pawn. The knight is going to shuffle across as fast as humanly possible. The king is going to head in, and the bishop will be lost for the pawn. And it's a nice technical display on Fischer's part. Knight f6, king e3, king d6, f4 in a bid to exchange all of the pawns. White's main hope in this particular position is to be able to sacrifice his bishop for that pawn whenever it reaches a2, and exchange all of these pawns, and the endgame would be a draw with only a knight versus a king. After all, we have 4 pawns to 3 on the king side. You'd think that it could happen. However, Fischer's not interested in exchanging pawns and merely wants to use the e5 square as a further outpost for either his king or the knight. White continues with a rather fruitless idea to bolster the f5 pawn break. Knight to c5, f5. But this isn't American rules checkers. We are not compelled to capture. Instead, all we need to do is reroute our knight to a square that controls a2 and win a piece. So, knight to a6, g4, knight to b4, f takes g6, f takes g6, h5, g takes h5, g takes h5, and all that's needed in this position is to step into the square of the pawn, which Fischer displays amazingly smooth and technical mastery here. With the king going closer to the knight, there's no need to rush that as we head over to capture the remaining pawns. The moment the knight is attacked, the pawn threatens the queen. And I've torn as to what the best move is here. I might have gone to c4 to keep the knight's movements limited to e2. For example, if the king goes to c4, the knight can only go to c1 and then to e2, and it might still be far enough away that we can try to create counterplay. Instead, Petrosian, I think, has given up on this particular game, bothers the knight in a manner, and then attempts to come in, and then chooses to resign after the move knight to d4. A fine technical display. The king cannot actually bother that knight anytime soon from the f3 square, nor can we actually bother the pawn on e5 if it's secured by the knight. In any event, I know the stream has been a little bit longer than what I wanted, Midnight Zero-ish. Please tell me where you're from, North Carolina Dan, but I'm bummed if you're from Georgia or not. Midnight Zero-ish. Yeah, the knight can just jump away. Never been to Savannah. Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So beautiful there. All of North Carolina, the Carolinas, oh my gosh. Absolutely perfect. Let's see for a moment here. The weather in Chapel Hill. Uh-oh, went into all caps mode by accident. 49 degrees. Interesting. I think we have the same temperature. That's hard to believe. Wow, New York City is warmer than Chapel Hill. Must be because of the wind conditions, right? You have no wind? Doesn't seem to make a sense, right? Humidity there greater. Isn't that amazing? I'm wondering if we have the right Chapel Hill. It doesn't give me the city name. Fascinating. In any event, I hope you enjoyed this game. You may review it at a later date. And, of course, you achieved a new rating goal. Awesome. On YouTube. Oops. Please review this game at a later date on YouTube and quiz yourself as you go through it to see what you remember. I recommend doing this periodically with great games collections. The master of this format, of course, is Agenmator, Agenmator, however you choose to pronounce it. And It is quite something. Now, I do have to run to teach, so I'm up against a wall. I teach chess 24/7. 2050? Nicely done. By the way, I don't necessarily know how Lauren is crossing 2050 and chess.com Rapid, but that is a level of accountability by setting rating goals for yourself. I only believe in another accountability because I like to play only in events. I'll play either in a Swiss event, as we organize these every single day, Swisses, or arena events on chess.com. 2067. That's a good year for you. Hopefully you'll make it to the next century soon. But yes, join the dojo on Lee Chess. We hold daily training events frequently, and you can set benchmarks for yourself incrementally by averaging your performances across a period of days or weeks. Thank you, Lauren, for coming. It is so great to see you. We are going to jump to the women's coverage of the candidate cycle. I hope you enjoy this coverage. Keti Satsalashvili is commentating with Artur's Nixons. And I highly recommend this channel when Chess24 is not covering things. It is certainly useful and logical. Yeah, Fischer especially was a supremely technical player. He did not go in for massive complications at all. Let me roll the ending credits to thank you for the new followers. I really appreciate everyone being here and making the effort to improve your chess by experiencing new positions. Please subscribe to the YouTube or any of my socials for updates on future instructional streams. I do post on Twitter routinely. And of course, there's the calendar, which you can incorporate, the Google Calendar or iCal, which is automatically updated with the latest events. And I do try to get the other thing. Cheers and ciao, and have a great day, everyone. Thank you very much, Lauren. Thank you, Matt, Midnight Zero-ish, and Sharpness for the follow. North Carolina Dan. Copaceticness, thank you for that YouTube subscription. Thank you so much, everybody. Ciao and cheers. Wait, you subscribed here. Well, I think that's a YouTube subscription when I don't get the notification here. Ciao, cheers and ciao.